A climber approached snowdrifts and brushed the snow from her. Beneath it was the body of Beck Weathers. That day, a fierce blizzard had claimed many lives, and Beck was next. The man cleared the ice from Beck's eyes and beard to look upon his face. From his condition, it became clear the poor soul didn't have long left. Meanwhile, back home, his wife, Peach, was waiting for him. She had grown so weary of Beck's obsession with mountaineering that she had decided to divorce him. However, she planned to tell him only after he had fulfilled his dream of summiting Mount Everest. The phone rang. Peach picked up the receiver. An unfamiliar voice told her that her husband, Beck Weathers, had died on May 11, 1996, during an ascent of the mountain. Yet, immediately after the group of climbers left Beck's body in the death zone of Mount Everest, he suddenly opened his eyes. The events that followed would shake the entire world, not just the mountaineering community. This is the story of a dead man who survived on Mount Everest. What's truly interesting is that Beck only became fascinated with climbing at the age of 40. Yet, this pursuit very quickly became his obsession. Beck had built a successful career as a pathologist in Dallas and had a large family. Despite this, the man fell into depression. One day, he read about Richard Bass, the first person to climb the 7 summits, the highest mountain on each continent, Kosciuszko, Australia-Oceania, Puncak Jaya, or Karstens Pyramid, the technical highest in Oceania, Mount Vinson, Antarctica, Elbrus, Europe, Kilimanjaro, Africa, Denali, North America, and the highest of them all, Everest, Asia. Fact: Richard Bass was a 55-year-old businessman and ski resort owner with modest climbing experience. His success in 1985, alongside renowned climber Frank Wells, who later completed the feat himself, popularized the 7 Summits challenge and made it a bucket list goal for affluent adventurers, proving that extreme mountaineering was becoming more accessible to determined amateurs. Since Bass was primarily a tennis player and skier who had never undergone specialized training for ascents, Beck, who also lacked extensive experience in mountaineering, decided he was capable of such feats. He began traveling on various expeditions, each time choosing more and more difficult routes to get to the 7 summits as quickly as possible. And, by his own account, this slowly pulled him out of his depressive state. But by engaging in this extreme hobby, he forgot about his family and almost never spent time with his beloved wife. So Peach made the decision to divorce him. But at that moment, Weathers was preparing for another journey, and this time, the most serious one. He planned to conquer Everest. Not wanting to upset her husband before the trip, Peach decided to wait for his return to deliver her verdict. Before Weathers left for Nepal, he decided to have radial keratotomy to correct his nearsightedness before the climb. This procedure involves making small incisions in the cornea. A certain period of time was required for rehabilitation after the surgery, but Beck was in a hurry to conquer the world's highest peak. He would later deeply regret not allowing his cornea to heal properly. Fact: radial keratotomy, RK, was a precursor to LASIK. The incisions it creates change the shape of the cornea, but they never fully heal. At high altitudes, where the air is thin and the eyes can swell, these incisions can spread, causing drastic and unpredictable vision changes. Beck Weathers became a tragic, real-world case study that highlighted this previously unknown risk for high-altitude climbers. And so, in May 1996, Weathers joined a group of 8 ambitious climbers, led by Mike Groom, with veteran guide Rob Hall as the head guide. Hall had already summited Everest 5 times. On May 9 at sunrise, the team set off for the high camp on the South Colonel. The climbers were supposed to spend a whole day on this leg of the journey, but no more. According to the schedule, they then needed 3 to 4 hours to rest, and after dark, they were to begin the ascent to the summit to reach it no later than 2 p.m. This was to ensure they wouldn't have to pass the most difficult sections during the descent in darkness. Everything started well, as the team reached the high camp on schedule. 3 other groups were also resting there. About a dozen tents had been set up on the site. The group that included Beck started for the summit first. At some point, Weathers suddenly became irritable. He found it difficult to focus on the climb because the mountain looked blurry. He didn't immediately realize why. As it turned out, at such a significant altitude, a cornea that has undergone radial keratotomy can crack and thicken. This shortens the focal distance and makes a person practically blind. Ophthalmologists didn't know this at the time, as no one before Beck had ascended to Everest after this operation. To make matters worse, Beck wiped his face with a glove covered in an icy crust. A crystal painfully tore his right cornea, leaving that eye completely clouded. At that moment, the team was at a point on the mountain called the balcony, at an altitude of approximately 8,400 meters. When Hall discovered that Weathers could no longer see, he forbade him from continuing the climb, ordering him to stay by the side of the trail while he led the others to the summit. Beck was left alone in the snow, almost blind. It seemed things couldn't get worse. But a deadly storm was brewing. In the afternoon, 3 other climbers were descending from the summit and saw Weathers. They offered to descend with him to the high camp, but he refused. Weathers was afraid that if Hall returned and didn't see him where he was told to wait, he would think he had fallen off the cliff and would start searching for him, endangering his own life. Beck expected Hall no later than 3 p.m. But then 4 p.m. came, and then 5 p.m. It began to get dark, the temperature dropped, and the wind intensified. Soon, snow began to fall. Although Beck was breathing bottled oxygen and didn't feel hypoxic, he understood that the cold was making him feel strange. He was hallucinating, seeing people. Beck's body was going numb because during the 10 hours of waiting, he had barely moved, only sitting or standing. But he waited for Hall. Meanwhile, the guide, along with the rest of the team, had successfully reached the summit. However, on the way back, another team member fell ill. Hall decided to stay with him until his condition improved. He told the rest of the group not to delay and to descend without him. Meanwhile, Beck was freezing more and more, but he waited for his guide. It was only after 5 p.m. that Beck's group finally returned. The climbers informed Beck that Hall, who was already a full 3 hours behind them, was not with them. Then, leader Mike Groom took Weathers with him. But very soon, a severe storm began on the mountain summit. The first to suffer were those still high on the mountain. Hall and his client froze to death, forever remaining on the slopes of Everest. Fact, the 1996 Everest disaster, immortalized in John Krakauer's book Into Thin Air, involved several teams. Rob Hall's team, Adventure Consultants, and Scott Fisher's team, Mountain Madness, were both caught in the storm. Hall famously radioed base camp, saying of his stranded client, Harold, Andy Harris, was with me last night, but he doesn't seem to be with me now. I'm worried about him. In his final radio communication with his pregnant wife, Jan Arnold, he said, I love you. Sleep well, my sweetheart. Please don't worry too much. The blizzard began to spread further and reduced visibility to almost zero. The group had to keep moving, no matter what, but Beck was in a terrible state. Besides him, a woman named Yasuko Namba was also completely exhausted. She reminded Beck of a living corpse. And he himself didn't look any better. The two of them posed a significant problem for the other climbers who still had the strength to reach the camp. Many would have long abandoned the weaker members to save their own lives. But this group did not abandon the victims. They decided, against all odds, to stick together. One man helped Yasuko, and the group leader, Mike, wrapped a short rope around Beck and essentially lowered him down on it. But 400 meters from the high camp, Everest was again engulfed by a deafening blizzard. Because of this, the team was moving by touch and went the wrong way. The group found themselves almost 8 meters from a cliff edge. The climbers noticed this just in time. Otherwise, they could have plunged from a height of over 8,000 meters. The text's 2134 m is a clear error, as the south call is at 7,900 m. Moreover, in this chaos, the nearly blind Weathers lost one glove. If in everyday life this would be an unpleasant trifle, for Beck it would turn into a real tragedy. At the altitudes of Everest, the temperatures are too low, and losing a glove can mean losing a hand. Very soon, Beck stopped feeling it. At first, Weathers thought his hand was just a bit numb, but then he lifted it in front of himself and saw that it was severely frozen and had turned an almost gray color. Then he screamed in horror, "I've got it." At that moment, a strong gust of wind threw him back into the snow. Weathers sank into darkness. Being a step away from falling off the cliff, Mike and the climbers who had the strength to walk realized they had been reckless with their heroism. It could make the situation even worse if the entire group perished. So they decided it would be wiser to leave Beck and Yasuko, get to the camp, and then return for them with help. But at the camp, they found only one climber, Anatoly Bukreev, and no one else, and they themselves no longer had the strength to go back. Then Anatoly decided to do what few would undertake. He set out into the storm alone to search. Fact, Anatoly Bukreev, a Kazakhstani climber renowned for his incredible strength and high-altitude prowess, was a guide for Scott Fisher's team. Criticized by some for descending ahead of his clients, he was also hailed as a hero for his solo, near-superhuman rescue efforts in the storm, during which he saved the lives of several climbers, including Sandy Hill Pittman. However, when he stumbled upon the freezing pair, he realized he could no longer help them. They were completely incapable of getting up and walking, and he certainly couldn't carry them both alone. So Anatoly hurried back to the camp. Beck was left to his fate once more. Soon, he froze so much that he fell into a hypothermic coma, a state that occurs due to excessively low body temperature, after which the body stops functioning properly. He began to sink into darkness again. On the morning of May 11th, the storm had ended, and the wind had subsided. Then climber Stuart Hutchinson and 3 Sherpas set off for Beck and Yasuko, whom they had learned about from other survivors. Yasuko's face was covered by an almost 8-centimeter layer of ice. Stuart removed it and saw that her gaze was motionless. Her skin looked like porcelain, but she was still breathing. Then he looked at Beck's face and saw that he was dead. Or almost dead. He didn't have long left. The men decided they were beyond help and returned to the camp. Beck saw the blurred outlines of figures moving away. He had been abandoned for the second time. But Weathers didn't hold it against them. He knew the unwritten laws of the mountains and wouldn't have wanted his rescuers to die with him. His eyelids grew heavy again. Meanwhile, his wife Peach sat frozen in horror with the telephone receiver in her hands. She had just been informed that her husband was dead. When Beck opened his eyes, he saw his house and his family joyfully running towards their miraculously surviving father. But then the picture faded, and he opened his eyes again. This time, for real. Music. Weathers was still delirious, as he had been in a hypothermic coma for 15 hours. Beck turned his head and realized this wasn't his backyard in Dallas, but the damned snow. Then he realized how desperately he wanted to go home. Weathers began to get up. He had literally risen from the dead. But how did this happen? As paradoxical as it sounds, the coma even helped him. While in it, his body had warmed up enough that he miraculously regained consciousness. How Beck managed to break out of this state remains a mystery to all doctors to this day. Beck lifted his head and saw that the sun would soon set. Weathers realized he had 1 hour to try to independently get from the south col to the high camp. After all, he had heard that no one had ever survived in the snows of Everest without shelter for 2 nights in a row. Beck simply walked, not seeing obstacles, walking through force, through pain. He hadn't eaten for 3 days and hadn't drunk water for 2 days. In his mind, he prayed for salvation. And Weathers actually managed to reach the camp. But they weren't in a hurry to rescue him here. "The dead man is coming," the climbers whispered to each other when they saw Beck's silhouette nearby. They immediately put him to sleep in one of the tents and left him alone again. Although all the articles I found on the topic stated he was left twice, delving deeper into this story, I understood that he was actually left alone countless times, and this time, again, he was not given any serious help. But there were reasons for this. Beck looked awful. And although everyone was captivated by his thirst for life, it was clear he wouldn't last until morning. Weathers again sank into the darkness of sleep, in the background of which he could hear the voices of climbers talking about the dead guy in the tent. At dawn, everyone was packing their things and preparing to move on. One of the climbers, John Krakauer, was checking each tent to make sure no one had overslept. "Hi!" Beck shouted. John stuck his head into the tent where that same dead guy was supposed to be lying. His jaw dropped. He simply couldn't believe that Beck really wasn't dead yet. This information was relayed to the base camp. Peach was called again. The woman was told that a mistake had been made and that her husband, Beck Weathers, was actually not dead yet. However, she was cautioned not to foster false hope, as Beck's condition was critical, and the tragic end was most likely inevitable. Beck was afraid to imagine what his family was feeling now. He realized how much worry and pain he had caused his wife by trading her for an extreme hobby. Meanwhile, a rescue operation began. An American helicopter was nearby and could have been sent for Beck. But helicopters cannot fly higher than the first camp on Everest, and Beck was at the 4th. Fact: the thin air at high altitude provides insufficient lift for most helicopters. The record for the highest helicopter rescue was set in 2013 at 7,800 m on Everest, but in 1996, such an operation from Camp 4, 7,900 m, was considered utterly impossible. The pilot who eventually rescued Beck performed a feat that pushed the very limits of aviation. However, due to the aftermath of the storm, the air was so thin and unstable that the helicopter couldn't even reach the first camp. So the pilots refused the rescue. Then Peach, who had already forgotten all her grievances against her husband, became obsessed with saving him. She began calling members of the Mothers of North Dallas group, seeking connections that would help her pull Beck from Everest while he was still breathing. This way, she reached Lieutenant Colonel Madan Khatri Chetra of the Nepalese army, who agreed to try to save Beck. For this, the climbers made an incredibly difficult journey from the 4th to the 1st camp to help Weathers descend as far as possible. When Beck was delivered to the 1st camp, Madan Khatri took him on a battered B-2 Squirrel A-Star helicopter, which was barely holding on in the thin air. For the sake of the rescue, the pilot risked his own life. It was one of the most dangerous helicopter rescue operations in the history of mountaineering. Fact: the pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Madan Khatri Chetra, skillfully dolphined the helicopter, using downward momentum to briefly touch down at the higher altitude. Beck, barely able to stand, had to be helped into the chopper. This daring rescue set a new world record for high-altitude helicopter rescue at nearly 20,000 feet. Beck Weathers was fortunate to survive the catastrophe on Mount Everest that occurred on May 10 to 11, 1996. In those days, the blizzard claimed the lives of 8 people. Usually, the stories in my videos about Everest climbers end here: he survived, or he remained on the slopes forever. But the tale of Beck demands a continuation, as he had to fight for his life even after being brought home. He faced a series of operations. The blood supply in his left hand was very poor, and in his right, it had completely stopped above the wrist. Reconstructive plastic surgeon Dr. Greg Unejohn operated on the victim to preserve any possible function of at least the left hand, despite the frostbitten fingertips. But the right hand could not be saved. And that wasn't the end. Beck continued to fall apart in the literal sense of the word. A large piece of tissue above his right eye, including the eyebrow, fell off into his hands. Then, the big toe on his foot fell off. His nose was also frostbitten, and the doctors had to amputate it. However, they managed to reconstruct his nose using skin from his forehead and neck, and pieces of cartilage from his ears. But Beck worried more about Peach than himself. Could she endure being with him now, after all this, for so many years? Beck admitted his guilt and told his wife she didn't have to go through all this with him now. She didn't deserve it. But Peach responded, "No. I'll give you 1 year." Fact, Beck underwent over a dozen surgeries. His right hand was amputated below the wrist, and his left hand was extensively reconstructed. He lost his nose and parts of his feet. The physical and psychological recovery was grueling, but it ultimately saved his marriage and gave him a new perspective on life. Now Beck has moved away from mountaineering. He wrote about his experience in the memoir Left for Dead. His experience on Everest was immortalized in several films, and he himself became a remarkable motivational speaker, father, and husband. Once, Beck Weathers was asked if he had the chance to do it all over, would he still go to Everest, knowing how it would end. He replied that he would, and added that on the mountain that day, he had exchanged his hands for his family and his future. And that is a deal worth making. How would you have acted if you were in Beck's place, or in Peach's? Write in the comments.